hopefully this is going to be an interactive space during this webinar, which is new to autism, and I hope you enjoy it. There will be chances as I'm talking to speak via the chat, and I will try my best to answer the questions as they come, and I hope you enjoy it. Next slide, please. So just a brief introduction about myself. My name is Paul Isaacs. I've been a speaker, trainer and consultant for over 10 years. I've authored 5 books on autism, which are available on Amazon. And what I try to do is incorporate Donna Williams' fruit salad analogy of autism into my work, my blogs, my ethos, and also just my whole, I wouldn't like to call it shtick, but my foundation for presenting around autism is using her analogy. I've been writing blogs on the subject since 2014, and I have prior experience as a teaching assistant, and later on in 2015 a day centre consultant and trainer. So that just gives you an overview of the professional aspect of my work. Next slide, please. So developmentally, there's some caveats of information I want to share just to give this further context. So I was born in 1986. Part of my autism is prematurity, which is under development. So I was born a month premature. For me, no sound. Looks like it's muted. Oh.
Okay, is anybody else having issues with sound? If you could let us know in the chat box, please.
Yeah, I can hear okay. Right, to the person who hasn't, so I assume that most of the panelists can hear. All 5 would love to know what the free, right, so the people who have got problems with their sound, there's, we've had to do this more than once, it's fine. Check your audio outputs on your laptop or tower. I did find this out from someone else, that sound and audio connection can be distorted if you haven't signed in through your Zoom account. And for some reason, I don't know why, that affects the audio stability. We sorted out my audio issues that finally, Joe and I've just got to keep my head still while I'm talking so that the sound doesn't fluctuate. So that, to the people who've got audio issues, it's a bit of safeguarding, I suppose, with your electronics. Check your audio, check your headphones if you're using headphone and mic, and also sign in from your Zoom account, because for some reason signing in directly has an impact on audio frequency. So I hope that helps. So moving on, so contextually, prematurity is part of my autism. Also placental abruption, and this caused brain injury, so cerebral hypoxia, and it affected the left hemisphere of the brain. So that was to do with language processing. There are genetics as well. I'm blind to the right side of my body, so the brain injury caused a condition called hemiplegia, which is a form of cerebral palsy. So it affected the opposite side. So the left hemisphere controls the opposite side of the body. So in my case, it was movement, motor coordination, auditory, and visual perception. I was non-verbal and had speech and language delay, and I didn't gain functional speech until around 7 or 8 years old. So that's around 1994. So if I had been diagnosed in infancy, it would have been of classic or severe autism. These words are considered quite arbitrary now, but hopefully it gives you a context of where I've come from. Next slide, please. Oh, one back. So that's me in January 87. Jaundice was apparent, and also what can happen with babies that have had a traumatic birth. You can, maybe this was kind of thankful from my mother's perspective. My grandparents had that sofa. Yeah, it's got that sort of grandparent-y look, hasn't it? The sofa. I was a quiet baby, so I was actually quite a passive baby, in fact. And at around 6 months, around this time, my mother thought I was deaf and blind. And my sensory organs were fine. It was nothing to do with the sensory organs at all, in fact. It was to do the way my brain was processing and perceiving information. So that caveat of information that I've given about myself is specific to me. It doesn't represent everyone on the autism spectrum. So what I mean by that is that my trajectory is my own. And with autism trajectory, it's a many roads to Rome scenario. So it's person-centered. And not only is it person-centered, it's specific to each person, which you'll begin to learn through this webinar. Next slide, please. So we have to understand the frames of reference of autism in terms of what people thought it was. And frames of reference are crucial, because if you're looking at something through a certain frame of reference, you build up a model around that frame of reference. So if you look at this pyramid, what you can see is different frames of reference. So if we look at the top one, so we're working downwards. In the 1940s and the 1950s, they thought autism was an attachment disorder. So what that meant was that the condition itself was not organic in origin. It was induced by an attachment problem. So of course that is a frame of reference, isn't it? In the 1960s, they thought autism was a form of madness, effectively, and childhood psychosis was used as a diagnosis. And the lady who created the fruit salad analogy, Donna Williams, was diagnosed in 1965. Initially, her mum thought she was deaf. She was tested for deafness. It was a language processing disorder, which was found out. But the diagnosis that was given to children like Donna in the 60s was childhood psychosis. And psychosis, by definition, is a breakdown of reality. In the 1970s and 1980s, people then thought that autism was exclusively a form of mental retardation, which is a very dated term. Retardation, retard, means slow. It's French for slow, so slow-mindedness. And interestingly enough, they were also diagnosing childhood psychosis well into the 80s, which is rather worrying. The 90s saw a shift, or at least a small shift, in terms of the different presentations around autism. So Asperger's syndrome was introduced into the diagnostic manuals. There's a DCM and there's the ICD-10. So it was introduced in those manuals. Then what happened through the advocacy movement in the 90s and so on, In the 2000s, it was a lot about sensory, so sensory perception, integration, etc. Then in the 2010s, with research and other aspects, gut, immune and metabolic disorders were beginning to be found. And then further on to now, you've got other things like Ehlers-Danlos syndrome and tissue connectivity, which is to do with collagen. So what you can see through each decade, there is a different framework, and through the different framework, the lens changed. So what I'm speaking about today, in 50 years' time plus, will be arbitrary, dated, because autism isn't one thing. And because autism isn't one thing, that is why I believe, looking at the scope of frames of reference, why autism has been hard to pin down. And we're going to look at that now. Next slide, please, on why that is happening. When Donna Williams was an advocate, she wrote books, and autobiographical in nature, and also handbooks. So what we've got here is an overview of these different pieces. So to the audience, I say this: imagine you've got a big metaphorical bowl of fruit, and in that fruit bowl is specific pieces that are specific to the person. So breaking that down further, you've got information processing, and information processing is big in itself. So you can have people with language processing challenges, sensory integration challenges, sensory perceptual challenges, etc., learning disabilities, aphasias, apraxias, etc. So what you're looking at is the diversity within what those information processing challenges are, how they present themselves, and what relevance it is or not to the persons or people you're working with, your family members, your friends, etc. The next aspect is something that doesn't get looked into near enough, is identity and personality. We all have a personality. Even the people you hate in the world and you think they've got no personality at all, they have. Human beings have up to 4 to 6 personality types. That can be a mixture of genetics, your caregiving environment, core beliefs, etc. And this is something that isn't looked at near enough because the two go hand in hand. Identity is all about how one views themselves, and in terms of autism and the diversity within that, and also the general human population, how does one view self? Self is a diverse interior reflection of who someone is. But you can break it down into personality types, gender, sexuality, etc. And that's what Donna means by that. But it's far more deeper than that. Then you have mental health co-conditions. Now, it should be no surprise to the audience that a sad caveat of information is 70% of people on the autism spectrum have mental health conditions. So that could range from anything from dissociative disorders, mood disorders. Interesting enough, there's a 30% overlap with obsessive compulsive disorder and autism. You've got impulse control, you've got dissociation, attachment, whatever. So what you're looking at is all the different layers, And what can happen with mental health co-conditions is that they can get misconstrued, oh, that's the autism, when actually it's something else entirely. So you're not only looking at the layers, you're looking at origins, and you're seeing the person as a person, a three-dimensional human being. The next aspect is environment. Environment is crucial to any human being, and if the environment is causing external or internal stresses such as isolation or alienation and feeling lonely, to presuming incompetence, to codependency, where the person gets into the sequence of learned helplessness, where they learn to be more disabled than they actually are. There's a whole plethora of reasons that make people autistic, and there's also a whole plethora of reasons that runs along with the autism that people think is the autism when it actually isn't. If you're keeping up with me, you'll understand. The next aspect is learning styles. Every human being has different forms of learning styles, and these learning styles can be visual, they can be oral, they can be kinesthetic, etc. And then what happens is you break them down further. Does the person prefer solitary learning, or does the person prefer to be in a group, or does the person prefer a mixture of both? So at this point, this is quite a lot of information here. Are there any questions at this point? I will, if there isn't, because I'm just keeping my eye on the chat and Q&A box, no. No, okay, I'll carry on. The next aspect is what Donna called the three phases of autism, which was autism, Asperger's, and exposure anxiety. Asperger's syndrome is a mute subject for two reasons. Firstly, it's removed. It has been removed. And also the historical aspects of the man himself, Hans Asperger, which I can completely understand why it will make some people feel uncomfortable. But what I'm doing is I'm not talking about the man and the things he done. I'm talking about the fruit salad of Asperger's. And I just want that to be contextually clear what I'm doing. And this is historical as well, in terms of Donna's building up of this fruit salad analogy. So on one side, you have Asperger's literal, logical, in terms of processing, have mild to moderate information processing challenges are literal. On the other side, you've got autism and moderate to severe information processing challenges, and as opposed to being literal, they are meaning deaf. So that could be two things. That could be language processing and verbal agnosia. So the perception of words is fragmented, or language itself is distorted. So when I was younger, just to give you an idea of what that was from a personal perspective, when I went to play school, I was around 80% meaning deaf. So this is why people thought I couldn't hear, because interpretive language was foreign to me in terms of language. So if anybody in the audience can remember Charlie Brown, and when Charlie Brown was in the school and you never heard the adult's voice, did you? What you heard was akin to a trumpet, you know, making different sounds. You didn't actually hear what the teacher was saying properly, and that was much what it felt like. Then the next aspect is exposure anxiety, and exposure anxiety is overlapping in terms of similarities to oppositional defiant disorder, reactive attachment disorder, and pathological demand avoidance. In terms of strategies, it's very similar as well. But exposure anxiety at its core is someone who struggles with self-awareness. So any self-awareness, I may add, and what that creates is an impulsive retaliation diversion responses. So what happens, the nervous system is negatively triggered by the awareness of self, and we live in a very directly confrontational world. So if you think about how that could affect presentation, if someone is living with undiagnosed exposure anxiety, how that could affect learning, how that could affect presentation, how that affects identity and self. Do they view it as a part of self, or do they view it as ego dystonic? And what ego dystonic means is against self, causing distress. So from this analogy, what I want you, the audience, to get is that autism isn't one thing. And the best advice I give, if people are struggling with this, take the word autism out of it and just say human fruit salad, and use yourself as the first foundation. So look at your information processing, your identity and personality, whether you've had a history of mental health conditions, your environment as a child, your core beliefs, your learning, etc. Right, so Emily Green has put, how does exposure anxiety relate to autism and Asperger's? Is it a component or something to be treated separately? Exposure anxiety is anxiety disorder. So it's something existential and it causes distress. And what can happen is the person is hiding from the world. And the analogy Donna gives is that it's the invisible cage. Initially, that cage may seem like sanctuary, but there will be times where that cage feels like a prison because self is put on a back burner and self has to be guarded. So any awareness of self that's made in its most chronic form, exposure anxiety, means that you never actually see the person. I worked with a young man who had exposure anxiety so chronically that even when he was in a separate room with no other people present, he was still protecting himself. The exposure anxiety is involuntary, impulsive diversion, retaliation responses. And the way this gentleman presented was he would go into intellectual litanies that had a beginning, a middle, and an end, and they were repetitive. And the reason why they were repetitive is because self wasn't being shown. Okay, there are other people. There are other people with exposure anxiety who may be socially threatening or distancing. So they may use swearing, obscenities as a way of distancing and blocking. There are other people who may go into self-hypnotic singing. There may be people who block in other ways that may be considered peculiar or odd, but it actually makes logical sense why the person is doing this. Now, what are the strategies for exposure anxiety? I'll go into later because I have a separate slide for that. Next slide, please. So the system of sensing is all to do with how people merge. Emergence is crucial. It's how we bond. So let's take a step back and look at this from when someone is born. And when someone is born, their nervous system is naked, right? There's no conscious association. So what happens is babies merge with people, places, and objects until the emergence is so succinct they may become irretractable. What Donna's theory is because of the differing levels of information processing challenges, the system of sensing, which is where all human beings come from, is retained in some autistic individuals. So mergence, not only with people, but mergence with inner emotional states of others. So this could be merging with trauma, merging with dissonance. So people who do not have a firm sense of self, merging with psychopaths and narcissists and feeling in danger, merging with other people as well, who make the person feel calm, make the person feel that there's an unconscious level of trust. And I've split this in my own way, in my own words, to wobbly and uprooted, and firm and grounded. So firm and grounded people have a good sense of self, have nothing to hide. They're transparent and opaque because you're merging with their energy. The latter may have personality disorders, a shaky sense of self, or they may have intrinsically other things to hide, narcissism, psychopathy, etc. So emergence is about merging with people before interpretive frameworks are given. And if we go on to objects, I can give an example of Donna when she was younger, when she lived in Wales, and they couldn't find her, and it was getting dark, and they walked down the road and found her down a lane, and she was transfixed with a lamp in the dark with insects flowing around it. And what had happened was this sensing, this mergence with the experience to the point where it's irretractable. Does that make sense what I'm saying? I can give you another example from my own personal perspective. When I go into a supermarket, I have to consciously keep myself in check about what I'm doing and where I'm going, because if I don't, the threads of interpretation begin to unravel, and then I get these impulsive things that come into my head, you know, the lickable surfaces, shiny things, someone's hair, someone's cardigan, etc., and I want to, you know, touch it, experience it, etc. Another example is when I'm although I haven't been there for many years, the tube stations in London, and I get enraptured by the colors and the shimmer and the shine, and what's happening is this mergence, and I have to keep telling myself, don't look at this, don't look at that, just keep your eyes on the prize and get to where you're going to. I've got another question, but these are just two experiences. Is it like when in normal language we say someone is obsessed with an object? Yes, you have to understand why the person is fixated on the object. You have to try and look at it from the perspective of the person, the interior mechanisms of why the person is getting the feedback from this. So what you have to do is take one step outside of yourself and understand, even in theory, how someone is experiencing something else. What we do too much is we look at things through our own lens. This is all to do with core beliefs. The psychology of core beliefs is your caregivers give you an understanding of the world, and some people can pull that apart, and some people just have tunnel vision and look at the world through that lens. Like I work with a boy who's always playing with spoons. Well, there could be lots of reasons why. He could be getting feedback from the spoons. He could have visual perceptual challenges, so he doesn't see the spoon as a whole. So he has to move it to give it life. That's called visual agnosias. But I'll be going into that later in the webinar. Would the recording of this be in a session available later? Yes, it's going to be on the Autism Oxford YouTube channel, so you can look through this later if you need to go for it again, or if there's any points that you would like to re-look at. Yes, mergence can occur with sounds. emergence can occur with anything, and all this because the sensory system is diverse. So yeah, in fact, I can give another caveat of information. When I was younger, I used to replay the ending of Return of the Jedi, and if anybody's a sci-fi nerd or geek, there's a particular scene in Return of the Jedi where Luke and Darth Vader are having their final duel. And every time I watched that, I would cry. And it's because I was merging not with the scene itself visually, but I was merging with the music. And if you listen to that isolated track on its own without the visuals, it's actually quite a moving, ethereal piece of music. And it was a way of actually understanding emotions on some unconscious level. So yes, you can merge with sounds as well. A lot of these people get misconstrued as being retarded or learning disabled or intellectually disabled, but what I'm trying to get the audience to think about is those frames of reference, and actually that there are different forms of intelligence. There are different forms of the way intelligence is shown, and if someone isn't necessarily intellectually stimulated, it doesn't necessarily mean they're not intelligent. And I think there's this massive stereotype about what an intelligent person looks like, which has to be broken. Next slide, please. So perception is everything, isn't it? There's two forms of social perception. Social emotional agnosia is someone who doesn't perceive social perception in a particular way. So on one side, you've got people who can't read body language, facial expression, or tone of voice. So all they hear and see is facts. They get factual information from what people are saying to them, literal. On the other side, you have visual perceptual challenges. And it's one of the reasons why I wear these tinted lenses. And visual perceptual challenges are diverse in their own right. And you can have conditions like simultagnosia. So that is visual fragmentation. So that is a person who sees in bits. So it's monotract. So they focus on one thing and lose the other. And that, you can imagine how that affects context, how that can have an impact on associative language, etc. The key differences in these systems is where they're coming from. You've got one side where the person is hearing and seeing facts, so they may be misconstrued as blunt. You've got the other side where the person is reacting to the sensory stimuli, which is coming from the modulation of visual perception, which means that they may look peculiar. But again, it's about looking at one man's peculiar as another man's normal. We have to look what's going on behind the eyes. So going back to what the gentleman said about the spoons, if one is living in the system sensing, they could be merging with the spoons. It could be that the person has simultagnosia and is only seeing part of the spoon, not the whole. It could be that they need to experience the spoon to understand its reality. That goes into semantic agnosia. Semantic agnosia is meaning blindness. So even though the eyes are working, the modulation and perception not necessarily isn't, and it's a different way of experiencing the world. So it's tactile kinesthetic. So one's hands are one's eyes and ears. They're like feelers giving information. And when I was younger, from a personal perspective, I used to lick, sniff, tap, rub the environment, because my body was giving me the information which my eyes couldn't, or at least that's how it felt. And with the tinted lenses, how they help me is they help me bring all this information together so I can see it as a whole rather than fragments. Other aspects can be a person who twiddles stuff in front of their eyes using peripheral vision. And they could also be using their hands, their arms, etc., because they're trying to process the information and get the feedback. So there are big differences between someone who is logical and literal and someone who is meaning blind, and understanding the differences between those systems means you can advocate for their fruit salad. Next slide, please. So what's the difference between sensory integration and sensory perception? Well, sensory integration is around sensory input, and it's to do with volume. So integration of a sense is the sense hitting the nervous system and there's a reaction. And that is a big difference to sensory perception, which is to do with the sensory organs working, but the perception of the sense isn't necessarily there. So what that could mean is other modulations to connect, blockages in information and sensor agnosias. I can remember a young man running up to me at a school I was speaking at, and he looked at my tie. He was fascinated by my tie. And it turned out that he thought that this was a teacher who had left. So clearly his sensory perceptual world was different, and he focused on the tie. And once he realized that I wasn't the person who he thought I was, he was very dejected and disappointed. And that's to do with face blindness. So you can understand that he's using other modulations to connect. It's a human connection. He had an emotive connection with this teacher, and the modulation in which he understood was by experiencing the tie that I was wearing. Now, sensory integration is something completely different. Integration of a sense. So I can give an example, a quick example of that. In terms of memory, because senses have memory, and that's not unique to autism in any way, but I'm going to give that as an example. A person who I know, their husband was cooking breakfast in the morning. They had the odd concoction of fish and cheese, which is quite a concoction. So from a sensory integration point of view, this was rather impactful so much that the person's whole day was affected by that sense. So it was a sensory hypersensitivity. And that sensory hypersensitivity induced a physical response, nausea, but then also an emotive response as well, anger, frustration, and then towards the end of the day, brain fog. So hopefully those two distinctions work in giving you an idea of the differences. Are there any questions here? Will a link to the YouTube channel be sent? Yes, it will be. Once it's uploaded onto the YouTube channel, you can ask for the link. Yeah, I found it easy. Yeah, learning so much. Thank you. You're very welcome. Next slide, please. So exposure anxiety. I mentioned this in a few slides prior, and we live in a very, very direct world in terms of communication. And if someone's nervous system is negatively impacted by exposure of self, we have to look at other ways of looking at their system. And I'm going to give you two examples, which I've given in previous webinars, but they're tangible. and they give credence to what I'm trying to explain. I work with a gentleman with PDA, and the main difference between exposure anxiety and PDA is one is triggered by self, the other is triggered by demands. And I went into the kitchen and he was being triggered because people were trying to get him to cook food. So what happens is you have to focus on the object, the context, not the person. So what I'd done is I looked at what he liked, and he liked Disney and these very gregarious, dramatic characters. So I thought of myself as a butler or something akin to that. And I said, the pan is ready to be tended to. So they were cooking something in a pan. And he went over there because his nervous system is being freed up. You're also being self-owning and autonomous. So you're being firm, you're being directive, and you're also being compassionate as well. He also had difficulties around thresholds, so literal physical thresholds, going from, from one threshold to another. So going from the cottage day centre to the path, from the path to the road, from the road to the car, and he was struggling to get over the road. So what I'd done is I said, the road is ready to be walked on. And he ran across the road because it's not a demand. Self isn't being exposed depending on what angle you look at it. Another chap, he had exposure anxiety around food, and he wasn't eating at the day sense. So what I'd done was, he liked mandarins or oranges, so I peeled the fruit, put it on a plate, and went into his room. But I happened to go in the room. So it's all about energy. I happened to go in the room. I happened to put that plate down, and I happened to go out. So there was no expectation. There's no direct communication. It is just happening. I'm being self-owning and autonomous. And sure enough, throughout the day, he ate food. So what does that say? It's about learning the person's system. This can work with people who struggle with exposure anxiety and food, exposure anxiety and toileting, because toileting, again, when you think about going for a pee or a poo for the first time, people may be watching, waiting, expecting, having a social audience, and that may not work for people who have exposure anxiety. So we have to think about reversing our own narrative of how to converse and talk to people who have this condition running along with their autism profile. Are there any questions here? No. Next slide, please. So this is the thing that doesn't get looked at near enough in autism, and it's personality types and sensitivities. And these happen in all human beings. So I'm going to give you mine. So mercurial is one of mine, and that means that I'm kind of free flowing, going and dipping out of different identities, interests, etc. Idiosyncratic means that I'm a unique thinker, and I dance the beat of my own drum, self-owning. Solitary means I'm asocial. I don't need a lot of social contact to feel fulfilled. Self-sacrificing means I'm eager to help people. Serious means I'm directed, and when it comes to work, definitely so, and morals and ethics, etc. So even though I've got a diagnosis of autism, there are other things riding along with my autism, and with those personality types comes their own sensitivities. And how many times has this been misconstrued as the autism? And what personality types also come along with is cultural views, environmental aspects, tolerance levels. I'm sure in the audience you would recognize the term a clashing of personality. I'm sure in the audience you have been around colleagues, friends, family members who just clash with your personality, and it's perfectly normal. So we have to look a bit deeper into those. And also, what isn't looked at near enough is autism and personality disorders. And this could be to do with varying different factors. Either it's undiagnosed, or the autism has been diagnosed, but there are other things, there are other caveats that haven't been looked at. So again, what we're doing is we're looking at autism in a three-dimensional, multifaceted, layered way, rather than a linear line where Asperger's is at one end and autism is at the other. It's three-dimensional, it's multifaceted, it's person-centered. If you ditch all the rhetoric and the stereotypes, it opens and frees your mind up to take in that autism is so much more. Next slide, please. In effect, what you're doing is you're working out the person's system, and it's layered. So what are their if they have any, what are their sensory perceptual challenges? Is it because they're so face blind that they can't see familiar members of their family or friends, and they feel isolated as a result? Is it because they see things in pieces and not wholes, and they've got a different style of learning? Is it that it's the child or the adult that appears peculiar because they're licking, sniffing, tapping, rubbing, externalizing to internalize their environment? Is it to do with the fact that they've got sensory integration challenges and hyposensitivities, which are having an impact on when they are in certain environments? Is it to do with the fact that they've got mental health co-conditions that may or may not have been diagnosed? So this could be anxiety, this could be mood, this could be dissociative, and all sorts of different things that are maybe misconstrued as the autism, but they're actually something else. How early on can these things begin to be diagnosed as they are diagnosed by a medical professional? That depends on the person's system. It also depends on what someone is or isn't picking up. It depends on genetic factors. It depends on the environment the person's in. Whether or not these things are getting recognized or diagnosed. Because for me, and this is only my personal take on it, that I developed dissociation in infancy, anxiety in later infancy, so OCD, exposure anxiety, impulse control, etc. So it's different for each person, but environment is key, isn't it? Understanding how the person is in their own social emotional environment, treating human beings as human beings. So even if you know all these different pieces, one should never take away their personhood. Are there any dietary disabilities? Think about that. It could be dietary intolerances or allergies, because they are two different things. And is that having an impact on brain and brain fog, learning, etc.? Social exclusion or embarrassment, if they're having bad tummies and getting diarrhea and nausea and vomiting. You know, these things can cause their own challenges in their own right. Are there autoimmune gut or metabolic challenges that some people on the autism spectrum have? Around 30 to 40% of people on the autism spectrum have autoimmune gut or metabolic challenges. That is pretty huge. That's a large percentage of populace that have those challenges, and they can range from something like eczema to something more life limiting or life threatening, because those are big big topics in their own right. If someone is functionally non-verbal, presume competence. I can remember working with a gentleman with Fragile X syndrome and autism. And I worked for him for some time at the day centre. And I researched about Fragile X, and there was a lot of stuff around low intelligence, etc., which was rather disheartening, to say the least. And the way this gentleman connected with the world was through Peanuts, not literal peanuts, the cartoon Peanuts. And he almost viewed Charlie Brown as an effigy of himself. And if we think about Charlie Brown, he's quite a nervy little boy. He's quite sensitive to things. He can get easily led. He's prone to depression and low mood. And interestingly enough, the gentleman in question was too, which I found a very interesting parallel of. And with this, he used to like printing out images of Peanuts or Thomas the Tank Engine. Faces fascinated him in particular, and he's functioning non-verbal. And I went to him and I said, while I was typing next to him doing my work, I said, Bob, that isn't his name, but this is for safeguarding, you're really intelligent. And no word of a lie, he took his fingers out behind his ears, not on his ears, behind, and I can give you a little reason for that. Some people with Fragile X syndrome have skeletal differences in their face, so musculocranial differences, and they're more prone to ear infections because the tubes are narrower. Now, behind your ears, you have something called a mastic bone, and this mastic bone somewhat props up your inner ear. It's almost like the cladding, and I think he got soothing from putting pressure on that mastic bone. So just think about that. Behind your ear, you've got that bone, and it's a mastic bone. There have been sad cases that people that have chronic ear infections have to have their mastic bone removed because the bone gets infected, which I've heard is incredibly painful. The gentleman in question also was deaf as well. So he's meaning deaf and had physical deafness because of recurring ear infections. But no word of a lie, he heard what I said anyway. And he took his fingers out from behind his ears and he said, I know. My validation of his competence actually built up trust, and through trust, we built up a relationship, because despite me understanding all the pieces of autism from a professional and consultancy perspective, I nevertheless saw him as a three-dimensional person of equal worth. And it's called being egalitarian. You see people as people. And the other aspect is the final part, which is working out meaningful persona-centered strategies. You look at the person's fruit salad, you find out which pieces are relevant, and you work with their system, not against. And this is to empower and aid the person's well-being. So in a sense, what you're doing here is you're modeling the world. Remember what I said about the caregivers and the core beliefs, which you get from 0 to 7? Well, let's expand on that. If you're working with people on the autism spectrum, be it adults or even teenagers or infants, be a good role model. Be somebody that they can trust. Give them a ballast or a linchpin to look upon. It's not about necessarily them echoing your system, but it's about mutual understanding. I had a shocking question asked to me many years ago before COVID when I was training. It was a social worker who actually pointed out through putting her hand up why she thought trust had anything to do with connecting with someone. And the way I answered that was very simply, trust has everything to do with connecting with someone, because without trust, there is no connection. And without connection, you're never going to get to know the person. Next slide, please. So if anybody wants to learn more in their own time about this fruit salad analogy and what these autism fruit salads mean, there are books on Amazon. There's Autism, the Inside Out Approach and the Jumbled Jigsaw, which were published by Jessica Kingsley, and they were handbooks by Donna. They're not the sort of book that you need to just open and read from start to finish. They're not like that. They're handbooks. There's chapters on specific pieces that may be relevant to you. So I highly recommend looking at those books, and you can get them secondhand also. Next slide, please. So effectively, going back to what I said at the beginning, autism is this bowl of fruit. In fact, what we should be saying is not autism as a singular thing. We need to expand on that and look at it plurally. Autisms. So you aren't at the risk of garnering more stereotypes and narratives. So you've got information processing, you've got sensory, mental health, personality, physical and genetic, motor planning, sensory perceptual, environmental, communication, and identity. So what we've got here is layers, and these layers are important to understand, to self-advocate, to empower, because in order to look beyond yourself, you have to work out what interior is going on without denying the person's selfhood. So the fruit salad analogy is mixing the medical model of disability, merging it with the social model of disability to create the empowerment model. The empowerment model is mergence of those two aspects. You're looking at the pieces, and yes, this is language that is medical, but you know, with the social model, the person is a human with equal wants and needs and worths. So again, it's about being egalitarian from a philosophical point of view. Next slide, please. So here we are. We've got, that's a very interesting question. I need to just go down. Here we are. Is there any books on working with deaf people who are autistic? Please, I'm a BSL interpreter. Do you know what? That's a very interesting question. I do not know, but I do know a lady who did work with people who are autistic and deaf, and her name is Phoebe Caldwell. She's elderly now, but she worked with people on the spectrum for 40 years. She did do a video mentioning about actually working with people who have sensory modulations. It isn't necessarily to do with just information processing of the brain, but also sensory organs. And she does mention this. So if you Google Phoebe Caldwell intensive interaction, you can find some information there. Also, Karen, you're actually pointing out something that probably has to be included into the autism fruit salad, which is, yes, there are deaf people who are autistic, there are blind people who are autistic too. So thank you very much for that comment. What else? So I hope you've enjoyed this webinar. There are other events coming soon. The next one is Advocating for Your Child in April, and that's by our peer support practitioner Hannah and autism nurse consultant Kimberly. So now what I'm going to do is pass it over to any questions that people have for me based on the What is Autism webinar and any slides in particular that you want to see. Oh, you're very welcome, Carol. Yeah. If you, Joe, if you put it on the slide before this one, that might give people a reference point. The fruit salad. Yeah. Yeah. There is a lot to take in. I'm just reading some of the comments. We'll be sharing this video with my colleagues. Oh, that's very kind of you to say. What one can take out of this philosophically is that the autism isn't one thing, and understanding the different systems is crucial. Not only for the development, your own personal development, but self-advocacy, advocating for these different systems. Jane, yes, not sure if this chat, but curious about PDA and difficulty around diagnosis. It's an interesting one, really. Donna done some years ago a blog around PDA and the differences and similarities in exposure anxiety. And what a book I do recommend is Exposure Anxiety, The Invisible Cage. And what that is a handbook around people who find the direct confrontational world extremely difficult. And because there is enough overlap between PDA and exposure anxiety, it's a good handbook to actually look at and actually learn from. There's a question here. Yes, you can have exposure anxiety on its own. Can I ask a person about your advice for my son? No worries if not. 7-year-old has been diagnosed currently. We haven't told him, as I feel like I need to know more about autism so I can answer his questions. Do you think I should tell him or let things happen organically? Well, I think what I would do is a philosophical aspect here is when someone gets diagnosed, they're still a human. And when I was diagnosed, albeit at 24, my parents were with me during the diagnostic process. And one of the things she reminded me, which was very important, when I came out of that diagnostic room and into the car to go home, she says, you do realise you're still Paul. What you have to do is get the balance right between understanding the different pieces of one's autism, but not necessarily to the detriment of their own selfhood. You have to get the balance right between selfhood and autism. That's the best advice I can give. Now I know why I'm obsessed with furry pom-poms. Yes, yeah, it's this emergence which I was talking about. Yeah, very much so. I have an interesting story around that. When Donna was doing a documentary before she died, she was in a second-hand shop, and she had around 7 handbags around her, and she says, "I just want to lick them." So yeah, it gives you an idea of how, you know, an object with all its interpretive frameworks can mean something else to someone else. So the interpretive use of a handbag is to take around and put your belongings in, but for her it was almost shredding away those interpretive frameworks. Are there any other questions? Are there any books that you can advise that people that can help adults who suspect as having high functioning autism, as it's draining, masking all day? I don't know if there are any books. There probably are some out there that talk about this phenomena, autism masking. I know there's podcasts, etc. But just a little caveat on masking, it would have to be understood on why the person is masking, and there can be different reasons why people mask. For example, could it be through dissociation? Could it be suppressing emotional regulation? Could it be to do with the language processing aspects and the shared sense of social or lack thereof? Human beings get that shared sense of social as young as 5, 6, 7, 8, or 9. But some people on the autism spectrum can either do all self, no other, all other, no self. So that can create this disconnect with people sometimes. And I didn't get my first shared sense of social until around 27. So it was better late than never, but that can cause challenges. So is it masking in the sense one is consciously masking? That's the question. Or is it something more to do with how the person's processing information? There's another. My daughter is obsessed with watching some particular TV program. Well, it's again, why? What is it about that program? Do you what feedback is she getting from it? What associations has she created around it? Is there a pattern? Is there a particular scene? Is it to do with the visuals in the scene, the auditory? Is it a mixture of those things? Is it to do with association? Is it to do with where she is in the house, time of day, etc.? There can be all sorts of reasons why people watch programs over and over again. Visual impairment, there could be some issues around visual impairment and what she's seeing, but she's still getting feedback. So it's understanding what the feedback she's getting, even though she's visually impaired. And also it's about presuming competence. So when someone says global developmental delay, although I respect the diagnosticians for saying that, you still have to presume competence, regardless of what frameworks you've been given. Usually parents are quite savvy and understand this. It's about using your intuition, I suppose. Are there any more questions?
I think that's it then, Paul.
Oh, that's good. Yeah.